Hello, welcome to Central Nervous System video 4. This video we're going to talk about the five regions of the cerebrum. But then when we talk about those regions, those 5 regions, they may have sub-regions and those may have sub-sub-regions. As you know, this is how it goes in anatomy and physiology. So this is just a review. We went over this, I think, in the first video lecture for the CNS. There's 5 regions of the central nervous system, and the central nervous system, as you remember, is the brain and spinal cord. So the first region is the cerebral hemisphere, and then within the cerebral hemispheres we have regions within that. The diencephalon, there's structures within the diencephalon. The next region of the CNS is cerebellum, but there's landmarks and regions and structures within the cerebellum. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 is the brainstem, and then there's 4 structures within the brainstem. And then there is the spinal cord down here, makes the 5th region of the central nervous system. Then within the cerebral hemisphere, well, there's 2 cerebral hemispheres, and together they make up the cerebrum. So within the cerebrum there are 3 subregions. There's the gray matter, that's the cortex, that's the most superficial part of this whole cerebrum, so that would be the cortex. And then deep to the cortex is made of gray matter. Then deep to the gray matter is the white matter of the cerebrum. And then sort of like peppered within the white matter is more gray matter. And that gray matter within the white matter is called the basal nuclei. So we have 5 regions of the central nervous system, and that first region, the cerebral hemisphere, or collectively the cerebrum, has 3 regions within it: the gray matter, the white matter, and the basal nuclei. Remember, I think we talked about this, or maybe we didn't talk about it yet, but the cerebrum is referred to as the executive suite. So that's where you make all your important, complicated decisions. So the cerebrum was the first of the 5 regions of the central nervous system. Now the second of the 5, and then within the cerebrum there were 3 regions. And within those 3 regions there's the gray matter, white matter, and basal nuclei. So in this slide we're going to look at the second of the 3 regions within the cerebrum. That's the white matter. So if you come over here to the right side, you can see the brain has a frontal or a coronal section through it. And then if you pull that piece out and turn it towards you, it looks like this. This is a frontal section. And it shows that you have different types of fibers. And remember, fibers are also called axons. So you have in these fibers, they're myelinated axons / fibers, and the green ones are called commissural fibers or axons, and then these red fibers are association fibers. And then this didn't line up well, this line, but these guys, the blue ones, are projection fibers. Okay. Oh, so let's point out a few more things. So this piece down here is the cerebellum, and then this area in here would be the brainstem. Okay, so in the white matter, so this is all white matter in this cartoon, well, except for this stuff out here, which is the gray matter, or the cortex. So the white matter, it consists of these myelinated axons, and they're bundled into tracts. They're responsible for communication within the brain. These commiseral fibers here in green, the type of fibers they are commiseral, but they're called, their name is the corpus callosum, and they connect the gray matter of the two hemispheres. So it really doesn't show it well, but these green fibers would connect the gray matter, which is this tan stuff out here, of the right cerebral hemisphere to the left cerebral hemisphere. And then you can just see in the cartoon the association fibers will connect areas within the same hemisphere. So this is the right cerebral hemisphere, and you can see all these red fibers are making connections within the same hemisphere. And then these projection fibers in blue, they connect the right and left cerebral hemispheres with lower brain areas, for example, the brainstem, and then down here in the spinal cord, that's where those projection fibers connect. So then I just put up this little note. We're looking at regions of the cerebrum. So we talked about the cerebral cortex of the cerebrum. That's made of gray matter. The cerebral white matter of the cerebrum, if you want to be the Department of Redundancy department, that is this slide, and we'll talk about the basal nuclei, which is gray matter within white matter. And this shows a cartoon. So let's see, we talked about the commiseral fibers, the association fibers, and the projection fibers. And then we also said that this was gray matter. And then all this white stuff in here, all the white stuff in the deep to the gray matter is the white matter. This blue thing is the thalamus cut in a frontal section. So we said this was the brain stem. So this would be approximately the midbrain, the pons, and then down here would be the medulla oblongata, and then this would be the spinal cord. And then this guy right here is the longitudinal fissure that separates the right and left cerebral hemispheres. Okay, the third of the three regions of the cerebrum, that's called the basal nuclei, and that's in pink here. And you can see the pink structures, and they have names. The caudate, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. Those are just structures within the basal nuclei. And then remember, the basal nuclei are pepperings of gray matter within the white matter. And so this bullet says that the basal ganglia, it's better to call them the nuclei, because remember, ganglia are found in the peripheral nervous system, not in the central nervous system. So I think the newer books are calling them the basal nuclei. And they're subcortical, so they're deep to the cortex. So remember, this is the cortex. So they're calling this anything subcortical or deep to the cortex that has gray matter. That's part of the basal nuclei. And that's what it consists of. The basal nuclei receive input from the entire cerebral cortex. So these pink structures get input in terms of their neurons and action potential signals from the entire cerebral cortex. And then the basal nuclei will send communication to the premotor and prefrontal cortex. So remember the motor cortices, we had a video on that, and it allows you to influence how well you move. So the basal nuclei, the communication that the basal nuclei sends to the prefrontal cortex is important in stopping your movement, starting your movement and stopping your movement. And when there's a lesion in this area, you see the phenotype of Parkinson's or Huntington's disease. Okay, we've looked at that. This just shows the same cartoon, but you have basal nuclei in both the right and left hemisphere. So these pink structures. And then if you do a transverse section through the brain, and then you take the top off here, and you rotate it around so that you can look on face, and here's anterior and posterior. It just shows a different cut of the basal ganglia. So here's the caudate nucleus in blue, and then the putamen and the globus pallidus together, so the putamen and the globus pallidus together are called the lentiform nucleus. Okay. So the second region of the central nervous system. So now we're back. Remember, there's 5 regions of the central nervous system. There's the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the spinal cord. So now we're going to talk about the second region of the CNS, the diencephalon. And this is a cartoon of the diencephalon in this area here. So obviously this is a mid-sagittal section through the brain. So we have the cerebrum up here. Here's the brainstem with the midbrain, pons, and medulla. Here's the cerebellum over here. And then this is the diencephalon. And then remember, there's 3 structures within the diencephalon. There's the thalamus. So this piece here is the thalamus. And then there's the hypothalamus. And then there's this little piece called the epithalamus, and that contains the pineal gland, and that makes melatonin for you. So again, we're in the second region of the entire central nervous system called the diencephalon, and there's 3 structures within the diencephalon: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. And so let's talk about the thalamus. The thalamus has a claim to fame that it is the gateway to the cortex. So most signals that come up through the spinal cord, they relay here in the thalamus, and then the thalamus sends those signals to the part of the brain that those signals are supposed to go to. So for example, if you have a pain sensation, the thalamus will send the signal over here in the sensory cortex. It also relays motor information from the cerebellum, so that's this guy over here. Takes motor information, balance information from the cerebellum, and then also from the basal nuclei that we just talked about to the cerebral cortex. Thalamus gets sensory input from all over the body, so wherever you're sensing something in your body, that information will go to the thalamus. Interestingly, we'll talk more about memory later, but the thalamus has a minor role in memory. The thalamus relays visceral and emotional information from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. Oh, sorry, from the hypothalamus. So here's the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus gets visceral information and emotional information. That information goes to the thalamus, and then the thalamus sends that to the cerebral cortex. So the second structure within the diencephalon is the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus does a lot of things. It regulates food intake, water balance, and thirst. It also will control the release of pituitary hormones. So here's the pituitary gland. It will secrete a lot of hormones that you'll learn about when we do the endocrine system. So the hypothalamus will control which hormones get released from the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is involved in a lot of things. It's got a lot of irons in the fire, so to say. So it's involved in biological rhythms, the sex drive. It helps to regulate sleep, along with the pineal gland here and the pineal gland of the epithalamus, and what it secretes is melatonin, like I said in the last slide. I like this cartoon because I show this in 202. So here's the pituitary gland, here's the hypothalamus, and then look at all these little guys in here: the PVN, the SON, the VMN, the DMN. So the N is for nucleus. So for example, the PVN is the paraventricular nucleus. The SON is the supraoptic nucleus, and we'll talk about those when we do the endocrine system in 202. But the hypothalamus functions as the major visceral control center of the body. So remember, your viscera are your guts. The hypothalamus regulates autonomic nervous system activity by controlling vital centers in the brainstem. And I should have put this in orange because this is on the test, that your vital centers are in your brainstem. So your vital centers include your cardiac center, your respiratory center, your vomiting center, etc. And the autonomic nervous system, well, the hypothalamus regulates autonomic nervous system activity by controlling these vital centers that live in the brainstem. The hypothalamus affects all these things: blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory function, digestive tract motility, your sleep, body temperature, urine production. So the hypothalamus does a lot of things, and it's got all, that's why it has all these nuclei in here. Remember, nucleus in the central nervous system is a collection of neuronal cell bodies. The hypothalamus is wired to the limbic system. We'll talk about that later, but that's your emotional center. Hypothalamus is involved in how you personally perceive pleasure, fear, and rage. And the hypothalamus will initiate a physical response to emotion. So some people get so upset that they could, for example, vomit. But the hypothalamus initiates those physical responses. And then this guy right here, the SCN, this purple thing, is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This is your body's biological clock. So your biological clock really is a nucleus within the hypothalamus. So it's not really a clock. So the third structure of the diencephalon is the epithalamus, and part of that is the pineal gland. It's the most posterior portion of your diencephalon. I told you it secretes melatonin that helps regulate sleep. And then this is just a cartoon that shows a lot of the structures and their names that we haven't talked about yet. But you can see the thalamus, the pineal gland, we've talked about the midbrain, pons, medulla, hypothalamus, spinal cord, and the cerebellum. This is a photograph of a human brain. So it's not a superior view, it's an inferior view of the human brain to show what the brainstem actually looks like. So this is the midbrain. This big structure here is the pons, and then this guy right here is the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata, well, the brainstem contains vital centers necessary to maintain life. So if you crush your brainstem in an accident, for example, you can't live unless you're on life support. Okay, so let's look at the three parts to the brainstem: the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. So if we come up here and we look at this cartoon, so here's the thalamus, this purple thing, and then here's this whole green, different shades of green, is the midbrain, and then the spinal cord starts right here. And then if you took this cartoon and you turned it so that you're looking at it posteriorly, this is what you'd see. So here's the thalamus, the purple things are the thalamus, and then this is the midbrain, and then within the midbrain you have these structures. You have a superior colliculus and an inferior colliculus. So collectively there's two superior colliculi here and here, and those are visual reflex centers. So these help coordinate your head and eye movements when we're following a moving object. So for example, if we're playing tennis and we're watching the tennis ball, the superior colliculi would it's a reflex center that would coordinate your ability to watch the ball. And then there's two inferior colliculi here and here, and those are auditory relay centers, so that is involved in hearing. And then also coming out of the midbrain is a spinal, or excuse me, a cranial nerve, not a spinal nerve, but a cranial nerve. So all these yellow things coming out are all cranial nerves. And when we do the peripheral nervous system, which is the next section, we'll talk all about the cranial nerves. This is a slide about Parkinson's disease. So again, this is a sagittal section. This would be the anterior part. And we're looking at the midbrain, so, and also in the thalamus, but in the midbrain is the most superior part of the brainstem, and within that area there's a dopamine pathway in this area called the substantia nigra, and in the substantia nigra, that's linked to the basal nuclei that we talked about, but it's important in starting and stopping movements. In Parkinson's disease, you have a degeneration of these dopamine releasing neurons, and then you get the phenotype of Parkinsonian patient is you get a persistent tremor even when they're resting, kind of a forward bent posture, and then a shuffling gait or walk. Okay, so then the second structure in the brainstem is the pons. So remember, the midbrain's up here. Here's the pons, and within the pons they have these things called peduncles, and then they also have some cranial nerves exiting from the pons. So for example, the facial nerve. And then the tracts of the pons, remember, tracts are just bundles of axons. They connect higher brain centers and the spinal cord. Within the pons, you can relay information, impulses, that's action potentials, between the motor cortex. Remember, up here is the motor cortex. So relaying information between the motor cortex and the cerebellum. So you can do that through the pons. Actually, I should have drawn it like that. Go from the motor cortex to the pons to the cerebellum. Cranial nerves 5, 6, and 7 originate from the pons. And then you have some of the nuclei of the reticular formation. In the pons, there are nuclei in there that help maintain your normal breathing rhythm. And then the third structure of the brain stem is a medulla oblongata. So that's down here. I'm not really sure exactly where it starts, but this is in this cartoon where the medulla is. It's the most inferior part of the brain stem. That's where many of the vital centers are, and I have that on the next slide. And then the medulla oblongata of the brain stem connects to the spinal cord. In the medulla oblongata, you have things called pyramids. So these ridges, okay, there we go, there's my pen. These ridges they call pyramids. There's two ventral longitudinal ridges here. Let's see if I can get my pen back. Yeah, here. And they're formed by pyramidal tracts. And remember, a tract is just a bundle of axons in the central nervous system. And then also in the medulla oblongata, there's something that happens called decussation or decussation, we like to say it. The corticospinal tracts cross over in the pyramids. So we'll talk about these tracts when we do the peripheral nervous system, but basically cortico means it's coming from the cortex and going to the spine. So in the medulla oblongata, there's a lot of centers, autonomic reflex centers. So for example, the cardiac center adjusts the strength of the heart and the heart rate. The vasomotor center adjusts blood vessel diameter and blood pressure. Respiratory center controls the rate and depth of your breathing. Additional centers in your medulla oblongata, you have a vomiting center. I bet you didn't know you had a hiccuping center, and a swallowing center, and a coughing center, and a sneezing center, all within the medulla oblongata. In the brainstem, so this is another cartoon of the brainstem, and it's labeled with a whole bunch of these nuclei going between the brainstem and the cerebellum. So this is the cerebellum out here. This whole structure, this is all the brainstem, and we'll go over this when we do the special senses hearing. Within your inner ear, there's an equilibrium apparatus, and that equilibrium apparatus in the inner ear helps you maintain balance by keeping your postural muscles toned. But that equilibrium apparatus in your inner ear will send information to nuclei in the brainstem, and then the brainstem will send that information to your cerebellum. And the one thing I have a line around that you have to know for the test is this thing called the vestibular nucleus. So anything that has vestibular around it, vestibular, vestibulo, all of these have to do with balance in the inner ear. So this is looks like not quite a mid-sagittal section through the cerebellum, but there are a lot of structures in the cerebellum. We don't have to know all of them for the test. There's cerebellar peduncles. There's this choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle, just on the periphery of the cerebellum. The cerebellum has a cortex. So this is cut. So all this gray, this brown stuff, this would be the cortex. And then the white matter deep to the cortex, kind of like the cerebrum, is called the arbor vitae. That means tree of life. But basically the cerebellum helps you produce coordinated movement and allows you to be agile. And this is just a cartoon to kind of put all the things together that we talked about. This is another photograph of an actual brain. You can take a look at that. Some more information on the cerebellum. Not a lot of test questions on that. Mostly the cerebellum, you have to know about the arbor vitae, this pattern within the cerebellum. And then the cerebellum basically plays a role in equilibrium and balance. And then the fifth region of the central nervous system is the spinal cord, but we'll do more on the spinal cord in another video within this chapter. Reticular formation, this is just kind of an add-on. It's not a classic region. It's basically loosely scattered nuclei in the brain system. They call it the reticular activating system because it sends impulses to the cerebral cortex to keep it alert. So what happens in this reticular activating system, you get a lot of stimuli coming in all the time, and the reticular activating system filters out repetitive stimuli or weak stimuli, which is about 99% of all the stimuli that you get coming into your brain. Reticular activating system filters that and just sends the information that needs to be sent to your brain. And it's pretty much throughout. It's kind of like nuclei scattered throughout the brain and the brain. Reticular formation, it says here, a few bullet points, connects neurons in the brain to motor neurons in the spinal cord. So that would be this red area. If you're going from the brain out to the spinal cord, you're going to be a motor neuron. Helps control muscles during coarse limb movements, like not fine limb movements, but coarse one. Has an autonomic function, so we'll look at it again in the autonomic nervous system. Within the reticular activating system, you find the cardiac centers, the vasomotor centers and the respiratory centers. Remember, we found those in the brainstem.